Good morning. It's Monday, December 16th. The multi-front war in the Middle East is now 437 days old. I'm your host, Jonathan Schanzer. Welcome back to the FDD Morning Brief. Watching some headlines out of Israel right now. The Houthis have just fired yet another rocket at Israel, actually a ballistic missile that appears to have been shot down just moments ago by Israel's Arrow system. So big news this morning. Meanwhile, another day, another headline involving terrorists working for the Qatari-owned Al Jazeera television network. This time, we're hearing that Ahmed al-Lou, a Palestinian Islamic Jihad commander, was working for the channel while operating inside a Gaza compound that was used to plan attacks against Israel. This is not new, of course. Since the start of the war, Israel has taken out scores of terrorists who doubled as journalists at Al Jazeera. It's all so predictable by now, and it's something we're going to keep tracking right here on the FDD Morning Brief. Today's guest is Mark Montgomery, FDD's resident retired Rear Admiral from the Navy, came on the show earlier this year. We're going to catch up with him in just a few minutes for a rapid-fire interview on everything from the Houthis to cyber to U.S. weapons production and more. Stay tuned for that right here on the FDD Morning Brief. Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, the leader of the al-Qaeda group that just conquered Syria, took to the airwaves this weekend to tell Israel to stop striking military assets in Syria. With Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad out of power and with some 500 military targets destroyed by Israel this past week, including Assad's chemical weapons, Jolani said Israel has no more excuses to keep attacking. Some people buy it, but I say that's October 6th thinking. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is an al-Qaeda group, formerly known as the Nusra Front. This group more than earned its place on the U.S. terrorism list. The group has tried to convince the world it has become more moderate in recent years, but HTS has to back up those words with deeds. The coming weeks and months will clarify whether that's true. Let's also remember, HTS is backed by two countries that are not exactly spreading peace and pragmatism across the Middle East. Turkey and Qatar, both backers of Hamas, the Taliban, and ISIS, undeniably stand behind the recent blitzkrieg victory of Sunni jihadis that toppled the Assad regime. I'm also watching Syria's new rulers to see how they treat their Christians, Druze, Alawite, and other minorities. That could be an indicator of how they'll engage with their Jewish neighbors. I'm not saying Israel needs to keep hammering away at every threat in Syria, but let's not pretend Syria is suddenly peaceful now that Iran's favorite Arab dictator is going to go spend the rest of his life as a guest of the Kremlin. Now for your headlines. Headline 1, Hezbollah chief Naim Qassem delivered a televised address on Saturday. These were his first public remarks since Bashar al-Assad's ouster. Qassem admitted that Hezbollah lost its military supply route through which Syria would use when Islamist rebels overthrew the Assad regime last weekend. During Assad's reign, Hezbollah smuggled massive amounts of weapons and other equipment from Iran to Lebanon via Syria. And that's just not happening right now. But Qassem says he's not too worried. He said that a new Syrian regime could eventually restore Hezbollah's supply chain, or that Hezbollah could just look for other ways to transport materiel. On that note, recent history is replete with examples of al-Qaeda and Iran working together, including on 9/11, then Iraq, then Afghanistan. So this whole idea that Sunnis and Shiites don't work together, don't buy it. Israel and the U.S., they need to keep a close eye on all of this. Headline 2, Palestinian Authority forces launched a counterterrorism operation in the West Bank city of Jenin on Saturday. It started after PA forces killed a Palestinian Islamic Jihad commander. His name was Yazid Jassia. He was a commander in Pidge's Jenin brigades. He was reportedly wanted by both the PA and Israel as killing sparked clashes in Jenin, which is a traditional hotbed in the West Bank for terrorism. Gunshots and explosions rang out as the PA set up checkpoints across the city. PA Brigadier General Anwar Rajib told the official Palestinian news agency Wafa that his men thwarted a car bomb attack, which would have killed civilians as well as PA security forces. Palestinian Islamic Jihad called for a day of protest against the PA. Hamas also condemned the terrorism sweep, comparing it to Israeli actions in Gaza. Jihadis in Tulkarm accused the PA of treason and warned that it'll pay for its betrayal. I continue to watch the West Bank. It's been at risk of unraveling since before 10/7. We're going to keep an eye on that for you here at the FDD Morning Brief. Headline 3, White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan was in Qatar and Egypt this weekend. On Friday, he met with Qatari Prime Minister Mohammed bin Abdulrahman bin Jassim Al Thani in Doha. They discussed events in Syria and the Gaza ceasefire talks, as well as ways to strengthen the strategic relationship between the U.S. and Qatar. You all know how I feel about that. We should not be working with this state sponsor of Hamas. At any rate, Sullivan then went to Egypt. On Saturday, he and White House Middle East advisor Brett McGurk met with Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. Syria and Gaza were on the agenda there, as well as was the Lebanon ceasefire arrangement, with both sides agreed should be the basis for regional de-escalation. But the major issue here in both countries is a possible hostage deal. And from what we can tell, a deal is looking possible, if not likely. But I caution against too much optimism here. We need to see a deal that releases every last hostage, not just some, because a partial deal is a recipe for continued war in the Middle East. Okay, it's now time for my conversation with retired Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery. He leads our Cyber Center at FDD, also known as the Center for Cyber and Technology Innovation, or CCTI. But Monty's expertise runs far deeper than that. After 3 decades in the U.S. Navy, commanding sailors, individual vessels, and a carrier strike group, he served as policy director for the Senate Armed Services Committee under the leadership of the late, great John McCain. So let's hear Monty's take on a wide range of issues right now on the FDD Morning Brief. Welcome back to the FDD Morning Brief, Mark Montgomery.
Hey, thank you for having me, John. Glad to be here.
All right. Well, all right. Let's get started here. I want to begin with where things stand with Iran. The regime's air defenses are totally, or maybe almost totally, destroyed, depending on who you talk to. The skies over Syria are now absolutely clear. There are people right now who are saying that Israel should just get in there and wipe out the Iranian nuclear program. My question to you is, can they do it? Is it that simple? What would be involved?
So, yeah, I don't think they can do it. I don't think it's that simple, but I do think they could continue to do a lot of damage to Iran. Don't get me wrong. But I think the wiping out the nuclear program implies like really getting at some of the deeply bunkered facilities that they have. And to do that right now, there's really only one weapon in the world called the massive ordnance penetrator. Tends to be dropped, if you want to be in a safe environment, is dropped from a B-2 bomber. And right now, those are 2 assets, the B-2 and the massive ordnance penetrator, that are only operated by the United States. That doesn't mean the Israeli Air Force couldn't do a lot more damage, couldn't do more damage to the nuclear facilities at all 5 or 6 different sites, depending how you count it. I just think if you want to actually remove all capability and capacity, it would require these massive ordnance penetrators, or a ground operation, which I don't think is really being considered right now. A special forces kind of ground operation.
Yeah, I don't think that's not the Israeli MO. But let me actually just ask you to drill down for a second. The MOP, the B-2s. I mean, there are folks that are saying, well, the U.S. should just loan those to Israel. Is that something that's ever been done before?
Yeah, well, I mean, we did Lend-Lease with the British, but that's a little different. That wasn't an advanced technology. It was just capacity. I think this is harder than it seems. The B-2s are part of our nuclear. We have 19 B-2s, a certain number on alert at all time. And to generate that number, we have a number, 19. So if we start giving them away to people, even for weeks or months at a time, it has an impact. But beyond that, I just think, my personal opinion is thinking about this would be a forcing function for the Trump administration to just say, do it. I don't think our adversaries or international community goes, oh, those weren't American. They were flown by Israeli pilots. I mean, at some point it would be seen as us. So we might as well have the people who operate the things for a living do it. I don't think this is an easy strike, for the bombardier and the B-2. I think this is a very complex thing. It would take a long period of time. And just historically, the Israeli Air Force doesn't operate bombers, right? They operate some fighter bombers like the F-15 and soon the F-15I and some new variants that are coming. One thing I would mention is the Israelis can continue to do a lot of damage to all the other aspects besides the actual nuclear weapon. And the strikes they did against the intermediate range ballistic missile facilities in October were pretty damaging. I mean, I think they reduced production, close to 90%. That's important, because I think Israel has to conserve its Arrow missiles for operations like might have happened earlier this morning, and so to do that, the Israeli Air Force can continue to strike things, and they've cleared out almost all the air defense systems that Iran could muster that were available on that night, and so clearly they could continue to strike. The question is, can they strike deep enough to remove the nuclear systems? And I think that's probably debatable enough that the best plan is for the United States to join them and just do it in one overwhelming, short week or less long campaign.
Yeah, and we're hearing people now saying that should happen. Whether it does happen, I guess, remains to be seen. I want to talk next about the Houthis. Obviously, we've heard the news this morning. It looks like they fired another ballistic missile at Israel. It looks like the Israelis shot it down. No reports of any injuries or any destruction of property. We had Captain Chris Hill, Chowda, as he was known on the program recently. He was leading the fight against the Houthis from the USS Eisenhower out there in the Red Sea. He confirmed, I think, what we already knew, and namely that the Navy has seen more action against the Houthis than they've seen since World War II. What needs to be done in the next administration to handle this threat once and for all? How do we end this thing?
Well, we have to practice the art of deterrence. And the art of deterrence isn't just deterrence by denial or defending yourself. And first, I would say, the Navy's done a good job here. 150 plus cruise and ballistic missiles have been fired out that have been engaged by U.S. ships. 2 or 3 have been kind of close run things where they got pretty close. And we've been a mix of good and lucky, and that's always good to be good and lucky. But eventually one's going to get through. And that's where you get in the other part of deterrence, which is you impose cost on people. And you impose cost on people not by fighting Iran to the last Houthi. They're happy to do that. We should be imposing costs on Iran. And here's what I mean. We all know that if a missile got through and hit a U.S. ship and killed some sailors, we would strike the Iranian production facilities that support the Houthis, the ports that support the Houthis, and the ships that go out to sea and bring the parts over or do targeting for them. We would strike all those things. But apparently, I think this administration is happy to wait, the Biden administration, until we lose some sailors, just like they were with Iranian and Syrian, with IRGC proxies in Iran and Syria, who fired about 168 attacks against U.S. forces before they finally got lucky and killed 3 of them. And then we struck back aggressively against them. But until they did that, we wouldn't strike back. And the problem here is, as Chowder said on your show, we've done about $1.5 billion worth of defensive operations against the Houthis. We've done about $500 million worth of strikes into Yemen. It's time. That hasn't worked. That hasn't deterred them. The way you deter this supply chain of Iran providing parts to the Houthis is to strike in Iran and potentially strike in Oman, where the logistics lines are, after you warn the Omanis. Stop it the next 24 hours, or we'll hit supply lines in your country. Anyway, deterrence works by holding the actual relevant actor accountable, not their proxy.
Agreed. And I got to say, I think there is an HQ in Oman that belongs to the Houthis that I wouldn't mind seeing turned into a parking lot. But I think you're right. We need to be more aggressive, and we need to make sure that we get rid of those threats in advance rather than waiting until disaster strikes. And the cost would be the loss of American servicemen. I want to ask you about something else I know you track very closely. We haven't talked about it much, I think, generally speaking, because we can't see it. And that is the cyber war that's played out since this war began in October of last year. We've heard little bits and pieces about it, right? I mean, little stories come out here or there, but it's actually, I think, quite a bit bigger than most people realize. What can you tell us about the cyber war between Israel and Iran?
Yeah, so it has been quiet, and I'd first say Iran cyber. If you went back 3 or 4 years ago, its offensive cyber capabilities were really focused on suppressing internal dissension. They're focused on suppressing internal dissension, and they were focused on taking on the diaspora, who was opposed to them overseas. That's where they focus it. Now, over time, they've developed some attack capabilities that they go against critical infrastructure, and they've tried that in Israel. They've generally been unsuccessful. But I would say since October 7th, there is another element to this, which is information operations work that's cyber enabled. There, we've seen Iran be more successful or more aggressive in both the United States, where they attempted to influence elections in Michigan and a few other states, appealing to Arab diaspora for the most part with false messaging about either Harris or Trump. And then the other one we don't talk about is China doing I/O on behalf of Iran effectively. And this is part of that kind of axis of authoritarians where China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea support each other. There is no doubt that TikTok's algorithm was adjusted after October 8th or after October 7th, but we can see it on October 8th and later to bias towards a pro-Hamas message. So it's 8 or 10 times more likely to find a pro-Hamas message on TikTok than an equal number of Instagram accounts. And the reverse of that, 8 or 10 times more likely to find a stand with Israel video or opportunity on Instagram than it was on TikTok. So what we've seen is IO and cyber being used. I'd say IO was more effective. And that's really because Israel has one of the better cyber defense systems for its critical infrastructure in the world.
Interesting. All right, I want to shift gears again. I know we're doing the rapid fire here, keeping you on your toes. I want to ask you about the U.S. policy of withholding some of those weapons to Israel. My understanding is that the ceasefire agreement in Lebanon led to release of some of those weapons, including the MK-84s, those 2,000-pound bombs that Israel was asking about. But at the same time, I also understand that we're running a little low on certain weapons, that there's a problem with the defense industrial base here in the United States and our ability to produce enough weapons. And that would include Israel, but also Taiwan, Ukraine, and maybe other allies. So what's going on here with the broader provision of American weapons to Israel and our democratic allies around the world?
So for certain, well, first I want to talk about withholding. I think we withheld a 2,000-pound shipment. What was more, and to my knowledge, for more than a year. What's been more damaging to me was that right after October 7th, we did expedited processing of Israeli requests. Now, part of that was that they were already approved requests, so we could expedite their processing. We just changed their place in line. Over time, starting in about April of this year, that expedited processing seemed to evaporate. Now, part of it was there was no more back-ordered stuff, and there's just way too much inefficiency in our foreign military sales and financing ordering programs. And part of it might have been political messaging. It's hard for us to determine that, in situ. I think we'll find out over the next year what it was, but it was probably a mix of those. But it did highlight a significant issue. And Brad Bowman, who runs our Center on Military and Political Power, is putting out a monograph on the arsenal of democracy and our ability to support Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan simultaneously. And generally speaking, across almost all systems, we can. But that assumes we're at max production rates, which gets to the other issue implied in your question, which is how's our defense industrial base doing, which was not good in munitions for the last 20 years. If it wasn't involved in killing, AQ and IS in Iraq and Afghanistan, munitions were always a bill payer. The theory being, I can always go back and buy those. I can crank the lines back up. Well, it turns out if Lockheed Martin says I can build 100 of these missiles, and you order 20 a year for 3 years, the answer at year 4 is I can build 20 of those missiles because I've moved equipment and workers to other programs. And so now we're paying a premium. First, we got to buy everything at max capacity. And we're now paying to increase capacity. We're contributing, the companies are contributing, and we're doing that. So the most important thing that's happened to our China war munitions capability, or even our Israeli support capacity, was the war with Ukraine. Because the war between Russia and Ukraine exposed this munitions issue in a very public, embarrassing way. And we've been tackling it now for almost 3 years, and it's improved our capacity. It's improved our capacity to build for China and to help Israel, but it's way late. Last thing I want to mention on this is after when Israel does its reckoning on why October 7th happened and how the response went, one of the issues is going to need to be what happened to our munition storage facilities. My belief when I worked there, I worked very close with Israelis as head of our mill-to-mill from European Command, including a lot of munitions work, was Israel kept their munitions levels at a much higher level than the United States. They had the 7th front. I think back then they called it 6th front, but 6th front, 7th front, whatever it is, you had to have a lot of munitions. I think just like in the United States, munitions became a bit of a bill payer. I also think there was an underestimation of how much munitions was required for Gaza, a Gaza operation. And so these are things you don't have to, I'm not saying to fire anybody, but study from it, find out the mistakes and get yourself more whole in that, because munitions are hard to get last minute. And final thing I say is there'll be a future where we can't provide munitions instantaneously because all our munitions, the vast majority of our munitions, believe it or not, have Chinese parts in them. And this is what these things. I sometimes I'd say I know the Israelis are thinking, what should we build our defense industrial base? I'd be very selective, because if we with our whatever it is, $20 trillion economy, can't get off of Chinese microelectronics for our weapon systems, it would become prohibitively expensive for Israel to build made in Israel only significant munition systems. So really what it is, it's an issue of stockpiling. And Israel needs to stockpile the living bejesus out of everything they think they need and always keep it at 100%, because Israel is not the provocateur in these operations. They may be the closing agent, but usually the starter, the first mover is Iran or Iranian proxies.
Yeah, that's for sure. I know we've gone a little long. I want to ask you one more, if you can try to answer it quickly. I know you've done a lot of work with our sister organization, FDD Action. You've been doing a lot of work on the National Defense Authorization Act, and there were some pretty big wins you guys got. If you can maybe highlight, 2 or 3 of them real quick, that'd be great.
So first, I'd say FDD and FDDA, this is the difference between us as a think tank and every other think tank. We do things. What we do here is 111 provisions in the National Defense Authorization Act across China, Israel, Iran, cyber, missile defense, Syria, all those areas. 44 are actual provisions, which means really aggressive, action will be taken, money will be spent. The remaining ones are reports that usually lead to action the next year. That's the cycle you do things in. So we're going to get, that means next year we're going to have an equally big successful year, if we keep working hard at this. Some of the big ones in my mind were some homeland defense ones for missile defense, some support to Israel. And then in my area in Cyberforce, we've actually set up a sub-unified command to concentrate on the cyber defense of our military systems. Unbelievably, something we hadn't had. We'd asked the Department of Defense to do it for a decade. Congress finally had to order them to do it. There's another one on getting a cyber force, considering whether we need a cyber force or not as a standalone service. So we'll see those coming to fruition, I think, over the next 1 to 2 to 3 years. But this is the discriminator between FDD, FDDA, and the rest of the think tanks in DC, who write beautiful tomes that somebody else can figure out what to do with it. We write good tomes that we take care of and get business done. And I think in the end, that's what you need if you're trying to move the policy meter in DC.
Couldn't have said it better myself. I want to thank you, Mark Montgomery, for joining us on the FDD Morning Brief.
Thank you for having me.
Man, the depth of knowledge on that guy across so many different issues, really, it's always a joy. Here's what FDD has on tap for you today. My colleague Bill Roggio has a piece in FDD's Long War Journal shedding light on Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, the al-Qaeda rebel group that played a significant role in ousting Bashar al-Assad in Syria. While the fall of the Butcher of Damascus may warrant cautious optimism, the future remains uncertain, especially given HTS's deeply entrenched jihadi ideology and its enduring ties to other terrorist entity. Bill knows all of this and explains it. He knows all of it like the back of his hand. In his article for the National Post, FDD's David Adesnik critiques the flimsy and Amnesty International report that echoes the claims of the ICC and the UN, alleging that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. We hear that a lot, and man, that word is thrown around a bit too loosely. David notes how Amnesty's report picks and chooses its evidence from a certain narrative and ignores the on-the-ground realities to construct that narrative, cherry-picking fragments of evidence that align with pre-existing beliefs while disregarding facts that undo its conclusions. Well, that's called confirmation bias, in case you're wondering. Finally, FDD's Hussein Abdul Hussein was featured in a Washington Post piece where 9 experts were invited to share their insights on the shifting dynamics in the Middle East following the fall of the Assad regime. Hussein warns that if the HTS leader, Abu Muhammad al-Julani, proves as ruthless as his predecessor, Syria could be in for continued civil war. We're watching all of that very closely. That is going to be a wrap for this week, folks. Or actually just for today. We're starting off the week. Read our expert analysis on our website, fdd.org. Read our quick takes on X at FDD. Check out our Instagram and YouTube channels as well. And support our work with the tax-deductible donation at fdd.org/invest. And please don't forget, the end of the year is fast approaching for that 2024 tax-deductible contribution. Tune in Wednesday for another episode of the FDD Morning Brief. Joe Gabeli, founder and president of the Lebanese Information Center, an organization focusing on Lebanese affairs and the Lebanese American diaspora community. He's going to be joining us. We're going to talk to him about Hezbollah, the ceasefire in Lebanon, and the future of that country with Hezbollah weakened considerably. See you Wednesday, I hope. Until then, I'm Jonathan Schanzer signing off for FDD.